Good morning, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of New Ideas, and with me is our one of our geopolitical experts and a longtime friend of the show, Jeffrey Nyquist. He is the proprietor for the blog, Nyquist blog, is a prolific author. He is a geopolitical expert, as I just said, focusing on the threats from Russia and China, which I talk quite a bit exhaustively, as many of you know, in my Substack, in my books, in my interviews with guests and other podcasters on other shows. It's something I constantly bring up. So Jeff and I are united in our efforts to warn Americans about the war plans of Russia and China, that the Cold War never really ended in 1991. Jeff is volumes of information as well as personal experience which corroborate what we talk about on this program. How you doing, Jeff? Long time no see.
Oh, I'm about old ideas. And ideas have consequences. So I like this guy.
Yeah.
Old ideas, right? Okay. So Richard M. Weaver. So I'm you call your podcast now New Ideas?
Yeah, it was a recommendation of a guest. So I went from the Politically Homeless podcast. He's like, you know what? Make it simple. Just call it New Ideas.
So your new ideas meet the old ideas, and I'm the old ideas guy. So, yeah.
Well, that's okay. That's okay. That's good. I mean, look, my favorite presidents actually are a combination of Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, George Washington, and very few, if any, in my lifetime. So
I hope you don't combine them all. It'll kind of wreck the fact that they're each unique in their own way.
Well, I think they all have kernels of all kinds of ideas. My ideas and my political views, as many in the program know, many of the listeners, as you are very syncretic, it seems to reconcile seeming opposites to create something new, even though it draws upon historical figures and historical experiences. So it's nothing wrong with old ideas and old people. I'm just more of a pragmatist. Does it work? Does it comport with reality, and does it help us deal with the threats to our survival and allow us to become a better country? That's all I care about.
Yeah, well, of course, I believe in what the ancients wrote about goodness. You want to cultivate goodness, and then the rest will follow. So pragmatism. I think we have a lot of pragmatists today that don't understand goodness. So as long as your pragmatism embraces goodness, then it's a good pragmatism. But I'm afraid so. And this is the problem with Mr. Trump. I think Mr. Trump is a moral idiot, I'm afraid.
Well, I think Trump is more of a transactionalist. I agree with you. I think pragmatism has to be informed by a healthy, well-balanced, intelligent form of nationalism, a form of empathy, concern for not, instead of tearing down the weak, building up the weak, as well as not despoiling the strong unless they abuse the system and abuse.
Sometimes building up the weak is always at the terrible expense of losing the strong. And if everyone is weak, then we all go down together. There are weak people who are criminals, because criminality is a kind of weakness. There are weak people that will suck you dry and leave you and kick you to the curb. There are psychopaths. There are, they don't use those terms anymore. There are wicked people. There are weak people. There are needy people. And of course, we need to be compassionate. I do believe in that. And we need to help people when we can. But we also need to protect our strength. And I think this is what America has not done. We have opened ourselves to the neurotic, to the perverse, and to the wicked, thinking that our compassion can make a wonderful world. And all we have done is we've opened ourselves up to degradation and decline and decadence. And this is what we are struggling with now in the midst of this. And it's true in an individual's life. It's true in a family, in a community, in a nation. And this is what I see with, I voted for Trump because the woman running was a communist, an obvious communist. And her running mate was a obvious Chinese shill. So I couldn't vote for her. So I had to vote on the chance this very iffy guy who I voted for 2 times before because the alternatives were worse, was gonna somehow Mr. Magoo his way through the modern battlefield, and he has not sunk the country yet, as the left surely would, but he's done a number of things like put higher tariffs on our friends and our enemies, threatened to abandon NATO and Ukraine, and although all of his claims that he's going to sanction Russia for murdering Ukrainians and kidnapping them and bombing their cities flat, he's done nothing against Russia. In fact, he's lifted some sanctions that had to do with the Syria war. So and then this Alaska boogie, I call it, where he's dancing with Putin, like Dancing with the Stars, and you got Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, showing up in a CCCP T-shirt, USSR, Soviet, with a very sour look on his face. And this is the Russians always use this signaling. And look, people will say, look, Nyquist, you're crazy. You think that the Russians are still communists when Putin's a nationalist and Christian. Clearly, no, he's a communist. I'm sorry, you've been disinformed. This is a man who, on the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, spoke in Sochi, Russia, before the Festival of Youth and Students, the World Festival of Youth and Students, the biggest communist youth organization in the world, and said, I believe in you. You are the future. I am with you. I mean, come on. He's supported by the communist North Korean government. He's supported by the communist Chinese government. He's helping the Cubans. He's got troops in communist Venezuela. He's building infrastructure in communist Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega. He's got his BRICS alliance buddy Lula da Silva, who's really a communist and turning Brazil into a communist dictatorship. What about this guy is not in it? Look, when his lips are moving, he's lying. Don't listen to what he says. Look at what he does. He's a communist. He's putting together the Soviet Union. And Sergei Lavrov was showing the whole communist world, look, this is what we really are. Here, see my T-shirt, CCCP? Mm-hmm. This is what it is. If you want to know the subtext, if you want to know the context, Sergei Lavrov's tap dance while they're doing the Alaska boogie there in Anchorage.
Well, I'm going to continue with the granular details here because there's even more to the story. I'm glad you bring this up. I feel like I am engaged in a very enervating task at times.
Enervating? How so?
Because it's very frustrating and it's very trying. Maybe I don't think I'm misusing the word here. And
the key thing to being a long distance runner is to not allow yourself to be exhausted, to pace yourself. Okay, so pace yourself, pacing. Remember, what was that funny comedy? Baby steps, baby steps.
I just take a fire.
You just do the baby steps. It is frustrating because we're surrounded by people who are ignorant and who think they know. And that is what's frustrating, because they think they understand Russia. They think they understand China and the world. And they've got it inside out and backwards. And so when they hear us, they go, oh, you're just crazy. And they attack you. And I've been attacked. I've been called every dirty word in the book. And it was only the day before yesterday I was bitched out on national talk radio by somebody who said, you should be ashamed. You should hang your head in shame. You're lying about those nice Russians. It's like those nice Russians.
Well, let's go through the granular details.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's go through more granular details, because I think facts are bullets to ultimately defeat the enemy.
Oh, I'm dead from a fact bullet.
Well, it's important. It's important for the historical record. It's important for podcasters, because you're not going to get this on network TV. You're not going to get this on talk radio. It's really independent media that's not in the full mainstream. That's really going to be where we have to educate, the avenues where we could educate people. Now, Russia really, since the 1990s and accelerating under Putin, we know that from Sergei Tretyakov, who worked for the KGB, then the SVR, he talked about in his book, Comrade.
He was a defector. Yeah, he was
a defector. He talks about how even during the 1990s, SVR was using anti-American disinformation campaigns within the United States, using various academic as well as left-wing cutouts in various movements, environmental movements, etc. When we take a look at, for example, various communists today, you have the Party of Communists USA, as well as the Center for Political Innovation, which have close ties to the Russians. They have appeared on several, at least twice, to the Russian organized World Festival of Youth, which is an age-old, almost probably a century-old Soviet front organization in Jamboree. So you have that. You have Caleb Maupin, who was the head and one of the founder of the CPI, works for Russia Today. So this is a paying career. I don't think it is anymore. You have the Workers' World Party. They have had ties previously, by their own admission, to the Belarusian embassy. And that was according to
in Belarus, by the way, the KGB is still called the KGB.
Correct. Yeah, it's one of the two officially governing socialist or communist parties. That and in Serbia are officially governed by socialist parties. When you take a look at the Uhuru People's Revolutionary Movement, they were found even under the Biden administration.
Uhuru, like the communications officer on the Enterprise and Star Trek?
I know, I thought the same thing. When I read about them. The Uhuru movement had ties with the Russian FSB, and even the Biden Justice Department prosecuted its leaders on such because they've had ties with them. There were actual national security cases involved with that. When you have Brian Becker, who's the head of the ever-growing Party of Socialism and Liberation, he had a program on Russian Sputnik TV for years. So these are the details that are publicly available that we know of, and more that I can throw at the audience here. But this gives you an idea. Let me
make a comment here about all these granular facts, because there's a concept I want people to understand, is that there are facts, and people have gotten to the point where they don't respect facts, because we're given in the newspapers all these facts, but the newspapers and the media never give the context, right? And there's a difference between fact and truth, right? And the difference between fact and truth is, with the truth, you have the context, you understand its deeper meaning, right? That's the importance of a truth. And the problem is that people have these facts, but Nevin, so what of all this? It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean what you think it means, that these communist parties, so what, there's some communist or socialist parties left. Eastern Europe's been free. Putin's a nationalist and a Christian. This can't mean what.
Why is Putin backing these communists? That's the point. The facts speak for themselves.
Wait a minute. If facts spoke for themselves, then the facts would come running into this podcast and go, "Hey, Nevin, I'm going to speak for myself now." We have to create the context, right? That's what we're doing now, is creating, which is truth, right?
Well, the truth is that why is a supposed Christian nationalist who's, I know all these arguments. They quote him, Putin, selectively criticizing Lenin and ignore everything else he says and he does. I mean, even Putin,
Putin is keeping Lenin in his mausoleum at the center of Moscow in Red Square as an item, as the god that is lying in state continuously in the center of Moscow. That's, if you take all of his criticism and you say, "Hey, Volodya, why do you have this guy lying? He's been dead for 104 years. Why do you have him lying in state inside your?"
Hey, buddy, you got to work on that Russian accent. It is not your thing. You being from Scandinavia, it's just not working. I'm sorry. That is the truth.
Yeah. No, I'm mocking them. So
I'm kidding.
Sorry about that.
I'm kidding.
You know, what can I do? I got my Ozbot, my camera, suddenly just did a funny thing here.
Yeah, I mean, the point, while you work on that, the point is all these facts create a pattern, and this pattern is Putin is still wedded to Soviet era goals. He's part of the Soviet culture. He has admitted that multiple occasions that he likes communist and socialist ideas. As you said, he backs all these communists and anti-American governments throughout the world. There are patterns developed. What the folks who say that Putin is a Christian, a nationalist, a conservative, a capitalist, they all have said that it's BS. It's not true. When you take a look and do some careful investigating, I mean, you even first reported this to your credit in an essay from 20-something years ago. We talked about how Putin was asked by a Cuban journalist, well, are you on the left or you're right? Are you a capitalist or communist?
He said, call me a pot, but heat me not. Another translation would be, put me in the oven, but don't turn on the oven. Yeah, don't put the heat on me for this, because, don't call me out on this. You're putting me under heat, because he really is a communist, right?
Exactly. Look, he's wedded to Soviet culture. The recent instant, and which I posted on my X account, and Foreign Minister Lavrov wearing CCCP, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, in Cyrillic. That is the abbreviation for it. It's very clear. When Putin and Lavrov has given voice to these ideas, as well as Dmitry Medvedev and others have given voice to the fact they want to create a new world multipolar order, and they start to allow Leninist, Stalinist style terminology to creep back in their speech. That's a signal, as far as I'm concerned.
I'm glad you mentioned Sergei Tretyakov, because I often forget about him. He's one of the KGB SVR defectors. That in his book, in the book that's written about him, where he gives his story called Comrade J, at the beginning of the book, the author explains how he got to write the book. And, he got introduced to Tretyakov, and he asked Tretyakov, why do you want to do this book? You're under a kind of a death sentence by the Russians. You're set, you've helped the Americans, you've defected, you're safe. Why do you want to give this story? And Tretyakov didn't want any money from the book. He didn't want to. He said, I want to warn Americans, Russia under Putin, Russia in the Russian Federation today wants to destroy America more than even the KGB and the Soviet Union wanted to destroy America. This is what he says. And he talks about a team of, I think it was 2 characters from the intelligence service working for Putin that had come to America, and one of their jobs was they were making lists of people to be killed. And they said, the problem is there's so many people we have to murder, we just can't get to them all. Right? This is the regime that people, I think before the show, we just were talking to Jimmy from Brooklyn about a Christian lady who's a missionary in Russia who believes Russia's a nice Christian country. And there's Christians going there to escape the evils of America. Look, America has more church-going people than any other Western country, and far more, almost 10 times the number of church-going people that Russia has. People who show up for church every Sunday, people who are serious about their faith. The idea that Russia is a Christian country is a disastrous lie put out by the Russians to fool American Christians into thinking that Putin's a good guy. This is the thing that what is his name? Owen Schroyer, the co-host of
Yes,
of Alex Jones. What was it, a couple of years ago? He said China and Russia are the good guys, America's the bad guy.
Yeah, he even used a communist-style term in that quote, which I quote in one of my Substack papers. And he's a very toxic individual on these foreign policy issues.
We're trying to explain how disinformed people are. What is the truth versus the, if I make an evaluation, Russia's the good guys, Russia and China are the good guys, America's the bad guy. That's not a fact, but that's supposed to be a truth. That is something that Schroyer and Alex Jones have gotten from their supposed investigations, and they're looking at the truth, and they're going to convey it to their audience. This is a truth statement, supposedly, but it is a lie in the sense of the big lie. And of course, you can give facts to color your truth. You could say, look at these injustices in America, because every country there's going to be injustices. Look at these nice Christian people who are persecuted in America, because we have this political correctness. There was the bakery in Oregon that would not bake a cake for a gay wedding, that lost their business and were ruined because of this, right? Because as Christians, they don't believe gay marriage is a legitimate thing, and they wouldn't participate, so they get sued, right? And so under these hate laws or whatever, I don't know what law it is, because it's ridiculous, they lost their business. This is the thing that turned Christians into, well, we're living in a woke totalitarian country where people can lose their businesses because they don't believe in gay marriage, right? So then these people go, well, in Russia, they're against homosexuality, they're against lowering the age of consent and all these things related to perversion. So Russia must be good. So this is what they exploit, but they don't realize that, yeah, we have a problem in this country. And of course, one of the good things about President Trump is he's against this wokeism, and he's riding the wave of everybody just got up to here with woke, right? We don't want this anymore. And the majority is just standing up and saying, enough already. We're going to have 16 different kinds of bathrooms for the 64 different, genders. it's like pretty soon it's just laughable. And we're just laughing these people out of politics, right? And of course, this is why the left lost the election. This is why Trump came back. But the Russians are exploiting it, and they're infiltrating the right. And there's these MAGA vatniks, right? People in MAGA who think, like Schroyer says, that Russia is good, America is bad, and the Ukrainians are evil and corrupt, which is not exactly look, the truth is very complex. Every Soviet country's massive corruption, and wherever socialism takes over, because when you have a secret police that have absolute control, that are the sword and shield of the ruling Communist Party. Look, the police are the organizers of organized crime. It's why it's organized. It's organized by the police. You look at the Al Capone gang under Prohibition, and you look at the mayor's office of Chicago, and you look at the Chicago police. Chicago police were working with the Al Capone gang in a lot of ways, unloading the liquor. Who had the best bottle of liquor in Chicago? The mayor of Chicago, right? Why is that? Because the people who really control the people with the guns, and the Al Capone's gang does not have more guns than the Chicago police or the U.S. government. Mobsters only exist in that space where you make something illegal, some economic activity illegal. And it's, the first part of the U.S. government to become corrupted before Prohibition. I think it was some years before Prohibition. They had this office that regulated when they made cocaine illegal. And I think opium, they were controlling, I think it was cocaine and opium. I'm not remembering exactly. That office, which is a pretty small office in the U.S. government, was like the center of corruption in the U.S. government, because they had control over, they could arrest these criminals who were bringing stuff into the country, and they say, could you keep bringing, we won't arrest you, could you keep bringing this stuff into the country, and you could pay us off the top? This is what happens. And look at the KGB. In the Soviet Union, everything was illegal, all economic activity. What happened, you've got Arkady, was it Vadkin? He wrote the book on the Soviet mafia. And he discovered that the Communist Party, all the local communist parties working with the KGB after the death of Stalin, they all became their own little focus of the creation of a mafia. Because what did they want? The communists wanted good services, and they wanted to have good caterers. Remember that oligarch caterer who became the head of the mercenary organization, whose plane got shot down after he tried to revolt against Putin a couple of years back? These people became important because they were serving the elite who actually wanted some goods and services for themselves. So this is what developed in side by side with communism mafias, which they weaponized sent over here against us. You see what I'm saying, Nevin? This
Of course.
complexity. Yeah. This
Yeah, of course.
complexity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They,
So-
you know, they wanted to create what one Soviet document that made its way to the West. Document was dated from 1990. It's called for an invisible party economy. That was the actual words. That implies a secret maneuver to do basically a strategic secret withdrawal from the public eye and to go underground. There's an obvious purpose for that, to deceive the Soviet people and to deceive especially the Western powers. You know, I trace much of the roots of this issue, and I get this too from.
This is why I'm not a socialist, Nevin. This is one of the reasons I'm not, because once the government starts regulating the economy, the regulators can now enrich themselves because they're the enforcers of an economic thing where there's filthy lucre at stake.
Yeah,
right?
well, the problem is the regulators are often, it's privatized. It's actually, especially under Republican and some Democratic administrators.
Well, the difference between private and public, private and government,
private sector partners
is a fiction. Because if you give me the gun and the power over something private, I can privatize it for myself.
Yeah,
I'm a police
we
officer.
got a fundamental.
Where's my take, Mr. Cocaine Dealer?
No, these are people that want to get rid of regulators or appointed. This happened under George W. Bush. It's happening under Trump. They want to get rid of laws and regulations that protect the public. You know, I know where you're getting your argumentation from. And Sidney Hook actually had a very good response to that. You know, the notion, it's the old idea of the road to
Sidney Hook, the communist?
I'm sorry?
Sidney Hook, the communist who...
No, he was actually an anti-communist.
I know he was an anti-communist, but didn't he believe in communism?
No.
A different kind of communism?
No, he was a social democrat.
Oh, social democrat.
He was a social democrat. He didn't believe in abolishing the private sector. I've quoted him at length, and he's actually one of my preferred anti-communists, to tell you the truth.
But you know, social democrats. You know, what was it? Someone once said to me, difference between a social democrat and a communist is a social democrat in a hurry.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. And James Burnham actually had in his book, The Coming Defeat of Communism, published in 1950, where he even got frustrated by the reactionary anti-labor business people, his terminology more or less, when they couldn't tell a difference between a trade unionist, a social democrat, an eccentric dissident, and a communist. And with that,
you're right. I've read Sidney Hook's essays, but let me ask you, Nevin, how do you like AOC? Okay, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She calls herself a social democrat.
Well, she actually, there's a difference. Number one, she's part of DSA. They are outright social democrat. They are outright socialists. They call for the dispensation of private property under the control of allegedly workers controlled.
So in your
number two, she is.
Even though hold on, let me ask you a question. Even though they have the word Democrat in their name, you think they're totalitarians?
Of course, DSA, because when you look at, am I saying every member is totalitarian? No. But when you look at their leadership, for example, and I mentioned this on a progressives show, Conavoy, I had a good program with him where I got to a more left-wing audience to introduce some of my more anti-communist ideas. I mean, my anti-communism is unique. I really am different from a lot of members of our community. It's pretty obvious. But with that stated, I cited the example with the DSA where on the World Socialist website documented this and linked it too. They were celebrating. Numerous chapter leaders, youth leaders in DSA were celebrating the assassination of Leon Trotsky with an ice pick. I kid you not.
DSA
That's totalitarian.
Hold on, let me get this straight. DSA leaders celebrated the assassination of Trotsky. When was this?
Let me look it up.
Boy, that's really crazy.
Well, that's what it is, and it's why I like to look.
That's very Soviet. It's very Stalinist.
Well, because they were always a questionable organization, to say the least, but within the past 10 years, they've become so radicalized. It's
You think
insane.
they always were? I don't know anything about the DSA.
Here, if you have your chat open, I'm going to send it to you.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. See, look, Jeff, I get in trouble, and I got this from some of the, not all the leftists.
Now, yeah, see, this is the thing that I sense with people on the right, is that a lot of people on the right, and I've been one of them,
I was too.
We look at a social democrat and we think, oh my gosh, this guy's bad. He's on the enemy side, but it's not really true. Social democrats can be very important allies against the totalitarian. There are social democrats. Many of them are committed to freedom and democracy. And although we
and are not
disagree with
hostile
them,
to private enterprise, they don't look at the West German social democrats. I encourage the listener to look at the Gertzberg program of 1959. Perfect summation of many of my views. Capitalism, but with anti-monopoly reforms and everything else.
But Nevin, of course, this is where you and I disagree. I think that, and this is what how I analyze it. Social democracy, don't you think it's proven to be a failure in terms of the welfare state and its the social consequences of the laws? You know, family courts, the whole, taking care of people. Yeah, I can see the taking care of people in their old age and things, but it's bankrupting the state. And
well,
so
America is actually,
I mean, social democracy has made it so that the Western countries can't mobilize for war against Russia because all the money is being spent on pensions and, on the elderly, on healthcare, because government has now gotten into the business of not defending society, but of actually cradle to grave taking care of people.
No. And I used to believe in that exactly. I used to believe in the views that you are expressing right now. And look,
you think it's the business of the state to take care of people from cradle to grave?
I think it's the business for the state to have a balance and use policies that work and don't work where the market, so-called market, is failing, and to look for other solutions. I mean, there's so much to unpack. That's why I've written essays, which I encourage people to read, which gives another side to this view without rejecting capitalism outright, at least capitalism as I understand it. When you look at the business of defending the state, what have the so-called deregulators, the libertarians, the so-called free market people have given us? They've given us their shareholder model over all other considerations, which has outsourced a lot of their industries. Here in the United States, that has happened with private equity. I have documented that in great detail in my essays, and other people have done this before. When you look at busting unions, for example, anti-communist unions too, I might add, led by Lane Kirkland, George Meany's, and others that were sometimes more stouter anti-communists than even in big business. Yeah. That, the thing is that people want to work hard. They want security. What have the free market so-called people have given us? They celebrate precarity. There's this elitism. You have deunionization, financialization of the economy. It is documented beyond belief on how that has wrecked small business and everything else. This is causing also anti-capitalism too. That deeply disturbs me. I say this not, you and I know this, Jeff.
Yeah.
You don't want these communists to come to power. But they are riding on the coattails of legitimate dissent. I have sat down patiently. I have asked people, why have you become a socialist? Why a communist? And we have to be honest with each other and ourselves. And we have to say capitalism has some really fucked up things about it, but it's still the best system. How can we improve it? I think you made a point earlier that's very important too. You need to also put in goodness and a sense of goodness. And a large part of the right, informed by people like Ayn Rand, what I see on MAGA and social media, this callousness. Oh, you don't like a job, just if you don't like a job, you can just leave it. Well, you know what? It ain't so simple. And not only that, in this day of layoffs, in the Trump economy, you have companies laying off each other. Why? Shareholder value. You can get more for the shareholder. That was popularized again by Milton Friedman and everything else. So here's where I have a problem with the left and the right and domestic. I am very critical of the wealthy people, but not because they have necessarily 5 yachts and $5 billion. That's not the issue. Mm-hmm. I get leery of extremists, what I consider extremists, national socialists, fascists, and communists, and proper socialists, as I properly define them, who just are blindly in an anti-rich crusade. Because what has happened, they've actually come to power. This goes back to facts. They fuck up the country. Excuse the profanity. I hope this video.
Let me interject. I've been in the business world and I've seen CEOs and CFOs behave abominably, where they have destroyed not just businesses but hospitals that they were managing. They've treated people like dirt. They have trampled down people. They have made working conditions for the people working for them to suck money out of the organization, because the bottom line is the only thing that matters. I've seen it with my own eyes, so I know exactly. I was involved with the business, a very large business at one time as a contractor, in which the people did not want to unionize. And that business had been run by people who had goodness in their heart for years, who had done beautiful things, and it was a happy place. And these managers came in, these modern managers, and they wrecked it. And the people, I had people, there were tears in their eyes saying, the horrible things are happening here. People are being mistreated. People are being hurt very seriously. And so I've seen what you're talking about, Nevin.
Yeah, and this was a problem.
I heard a CEO, I heard with my own ears, a CEO laugh to the CFO about how many yachts and sailboats they own and how much more money they can suck out of this business. And they're not even the owners of the business, right?
And people get sucked into the communists thinking, oh, we love you. We were going to promise you the world. And they're gaining traction.
When they didn't even want to unionize.
Yeah. Okay. Why do you need a union when the company is treating you well?
So you don't need a union. I've seen it, and of course, this does go back to the goodness thing. That we have to know good from evil, and in everything is stewardship, right? If you're running a business, you have a responsibility to your employees, to your customers. It is not, oh, I get to be power and I get to squeeze this for all the money it's worth and I get to enrich myself. That ethic is evil, right? That sort of financial bottom line thinking. And everybody that I met, and I lived in Southern California for a while, and Northern California, lived in Southern California for a while, and I saw it. It was very common in Orange County back in the 80s and 90s. When I encountered that mentality, it was always the person who had that mentality was obnoxious on one level, vile on another level. And it just, I can see how people would become socialists looking at that.
And that's what they've said. I've documented it in my books and in my papers incessantly. And where I have a problem with the left has the problem with me is I don't have an issue with rich people per se. Plus, when I bring my anti-communist element into my analysis and my, if you want to call it a populist element, I get in trouble at times because, oh, Nevin, you're just fear-mongering. The Cold War is over. You're doing Red Scare stuff and everything. And I get that. And some on the left really listen to what I have to say and are like, yeah, he's right.
Well, to go to a Greek mythology, there's the Scylla and Charybdis, right? The two monsters in in the Odyssey. You know, Odysseus is trying to get home, and he's sailing, and he's encountering all, you know, the sirens and the Cyclops and the or whatever. No, he encounters this. He has to pass his ship between these two monsters, and if he goes too far one way or too far another way, he ends up being devoured. Right? They end up getting it. Scylla and Charybdis, and of course, you could say communism is the Scylla, and dog eat dog capitalism is the Charybdis, right?
Yeah.
The sort of so you have this problem of how to navigate between the two, and you've got people who say, big businessmen and the banksters, they're the evil, right? And then you've got, they're the worst. Scylla is worse. Steer towards Charybdis. And then there's the people that point out, well, communism murdered 100 million people in the 20th century. It's much worse. I'm on the side that says communism is much worse because the government has guns, and you can't, you can maybe get your family out of a business, but when the government controls, what did Trotsky say? He said, everybody works for us. So nobody can revolt because we decide everybody has to eat through us. So we control everything. That is much worse objectively. But there's a funny thing. If you still steer too close to Charybdis, you'll end up, overcompensating and going right into Scylla, right? This is what you end up doing. And so there is a truth here that we need to have this balance between the two things. That is, we have to have good stewardship. How do we have, and this is, people say, oh, Nyquist, what do you believe the right form of government is? And I say, and I've said this to you before, Nevin, I believe in checks and balances. The thing about a businessman is he has one check on him that other people don't, the marketplace and the consumer. Consumers can say, I don't want your product. Or consumers could say, you're morally obnoxious. I'm not going to, or employees, I'm not going to work for you. And I think that the market isn't perfect. It doesn't automatically, as the free marketers say, bring you the best result. If your moral compass is broken, right? That doesn't automatically happen. But this discussion is, I think, useful. And I think that the people on the right that I know, my friends, because I believe in economic freedom, their condemnation of social democrats is too strident. Social democrats are your allies, especially the social democrats in Europe. And we have to have an intelligent discussion about what social democracy has gotten wrong. And because, let's face it, we are societies. We have to do things together. There is such a thing as a collective, of Americans, of Swedes, of Germans, of, Englishmen. And we need to protect our societies. And so we need a kind of wisdom, which is, there's no wisdom without goodness, and common sense. And of course, we have to have a spiritual point of view ultimately about this, and a stewardship. So we need to conceive of it in this way. If we don't, we are going to be sucked into Scylla or Charybdis, right?
Right. Yeah. When it comes to the economic issues, I mean, I look at it in a very nuanced fashion as well. It would take an entire show. I mean, I would just encourage people to read my Substack, and I give air to a lot of my economic views. It's very much a hybrid. Basically, I'm for mid 20th century American capitalism from the period from the 1940s until about 1981. And I think that is the best system that has worked from a national security point of view, from a domestic economic prosperity view.
You don't think Reagan did anything right?
No, well, he did. No, basically.
Let me give you a counterbalance
on domestic economics. No.
Let me give you a statistic. This is the thing that troubles me about social democracy. Under Jimmy Carter, you had government growing at 8% a year, growing at twice the rate the economy was growing. and this was going to eat that. This is like a cancer economically. You had Ronald Reagan came in, and suddenly the growth of government went to 4%, which was just slightly below, a fraction of a percentage below the growth. So now suddenly you could technically outgrow your indebtedness and the government swallowing everything up, right? Because remember, if the government grows faster than the economy, you are going to crash and burn. There is no escaping that. The free marketeers are right about that. So what do you say about that generality?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, you have to look at the details really of that situation. Carter.
But isn't it true that Reagan rescued the economy was failing under?
He absolutely did not. He actually invited the financialization and more of the deindustrialization.
This is where look, it is true that some of the deregulation was bad, but not all bad. They cut back the growth in government spending.
Well, you have to look at government spending is not.
Can't you admit that part was good?
Yeah, you have to look at government spending as neither an unalloyed bad or a good thing. It depends on what the spending is. Whereas something like Head Start program actually allow people from non-privileged backgrounds, to give one example, to better themselves, the parents who didn't have the resources. Now, on the other hand, on your issue, so that's that government spending. Jimmy Carter also did a lot of deregulation, which started a lot of the monopolization and financialization of the economy, the trucking industry, the airline industry.
Yeah,
also the laws which prevented high usury type of rates, the Monetary Control Act of 1980. Carter continued the process of deregulating.
This is much too granular for this kind of discussion. But getting back to the point.
No, it's been a good discussion so far.
I mean, I boggles my mind. You've got a cancer where the cancer is overwhelming the patient and is going to kill the patient, and you don't see that containing the cancer of government spending outgrowing the growth of the economy. You don't see that as socialization of the economy and the ultimate killing of the goose that laid the golden egg. You don't see that.
Government spending do you oppose? Because I'm not for the government. To take an extreme example, let's take UBI, which we don't have on a national level. I'm not for that for obvious reasons. But again, you have to look. I mean, you have to look at the individual cases. It's not just all government bad and good. And Reagan, we went from a net creditor nation to net debtor nation starting under Reagan. It was, in fact, an announcement from, I think, the Department of State in 1985, which I quote. And that was because he combined these tax cuts, which
have you read Max Weber?
Yeah, a long time ago in graduate school in freshman year political science.
Do you remember any of it?
Bits and pieces. I mean, what are you getting at?
See, the thing is that, again, going to truth and of course it's controversial. He was making a suggestion, really. He wasn't really saying firm, but he was suggesting that there was a spiritual and religious side to the fact that business, he said, all societies have been capitalistic. And of course, people who study the history of the USSR would say, look, the USSR was really a mercantilist capitalist system. It's just a capitalist system where the police and the Communist Party were really controlling it, right? But it's still capitalism. There's still people buying and selling and trading and making deals, because you can't have an economy at all. As Ludwig von Mises pointed out in his book, Socialism, you can't have any kind of economy at all. You're in the Stone Age where people are picking up sharp rocks to make spearheads out of, right? You hunter-gatherer society is your communist society, but anything more sophisticated, you have capitalism. Basically, you have people who are accumulating and who are buying and selling and doing these things. The question is, which people with guns are controlling the process, right? What kind of, what is the ruling class, as Max Weber said? It isn't a question of whether you're going to have an oligarchy. It's which form of oligarchy you talk about. Robert Michel's iron law of oligarchy. Democracy is just another way of organizing oligarchy, right? So
Yeah,
what Max Weber says in this is he says that for the first time, capitalism wasn't this exploitive thing that it had been, where the capitalists are just another form of sharp practice pirates. I mean, they were buying and selling, but they were cheating and robbing along the way. And he said, suddenly you had a system emerging in the Protestant countries where you could have massive accumulation, where the businessmen were honest, they kept to their word, and you could have long-term investment, long-term turnover, and you could have this tremendous machine that raised the standard of living and made life better for, like, what was it, the JFK administration, a rising tide lifts all
rising
boats.
tide lifts all boats, yes.
Right? So that this was the idea of, and this is why the Kennedy administration did the same thing. The Reagan administration was really copying the Kennedys when they cut back on taxes, and actually the economy grew so much that it took care of, you actually had more revenue than less, right? When you cut back.
And I disagree with that. That's why
the facts are there. This works.
Well, the facts are in my essays where I discuss this, as well as my upcoming paper I'm working on the Reagan administration. Now, when it comes to the tax,
I think maybe you aren't admitting that Reagan isn't all bad, that the Reagan policies aren't all bad. You want to make
the domestic policies, most of it I take issue with. I think he was much better on his foreign policy, although his foreign policy was fraught with contradictions.
Did he do anything good in California when he was governor in terms of saving?
I only studied more of his presidency.
Really, there was a lot of creative thinking with Reagan on a lot of issues. But
look, I used to support him. I used to believe the same things you did. And you know what actually turned me around was actually certain conservatives. Anthony Harrigan, who I've referenced many times, William R. Hawkins, who I think you even interviewed once or twice, as well as also Don McIlvaney, who himself is a hardcore libertarian, but in his McIlvaney Intelligence Advisor, it took conservatives who were anti-socialists and anti-communists, and their facts that they laid out, I'm like, oh my God.
Well, remember, real conservatives are not libertarians, right? Because they have the moral, spiritual angle is uppermost in their minds. So the idea of stewardship is very important, and the idea of chivalry and treating people decently. This is, Edmund Burke. I mean, Edmund Burke was a moral giant. I think it was William Macaulay said that he was the greatest man of the 18th century, Edmund Burke. And Russell Kirk, who wrote The Conservative Mind, who really starts out with Burke saying, look, goodness and the spiritualizing factors, the moral imagination is what we need to counteract these brutal, bottom line sort of, and this is the problem with the Ayn Rand sort of ruthlessness. Yet the laws of economics, if you go to Baum Verwerk and his criticism of Marx, and he's saying how an economy works, these guys really do understand economics. And this is why Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan turned around the US and British economies in a way which we have forgotten this, right? Don't you think?
No, actually, I disagree. I mean, Clinton and Trump and George W. Bush continued those policies. Look, like with getting back to the tax issue, my view on taxes, as I've written, and look, I'm not a know-it-all, nor are you. We're educated in these issues. We agree with the basics of free enterprise, what you were referencing earlier, your ideal, I totally agree with. That you're referencing Max Weber and other economists as the ideal business consumer / labor relationships. I'm 100% for that. There's no question about it. Our goals, we just go about in somewhat slightly different ways.
Let me ask you a question.
Regarding taxes, because I do want an opportunity to respond, because you mentioned a lot of things here. Taxes, my view is as low as possible and as high as needed. I reject the Marxist confiscatory taxation, like, okay, it's bad that somebody has $1 billion or $1 trillion, therefore we should just redistribute it. I don't agree with that line of thinking. I never have. On the other hand, when I look at the Reagan model of the tax cuts. It was sold to us promising, because I remember seeing a video. There's actually a very good documentary called The Business of America, which came out under the first Reagan administration. And it talked about US Steel. You may remember this. And the way the tax cuts of 1981, 82, and 86 were sold to the American people was with jumpstart production. It made sense. Business people, investors would have more money. The logical thing is they would invest it in a steel plant and everything else. If the tax cuts were incentivized in that fashion, of course, anybody would be for that, for capitalism, you or I. The problem is that the incentives were more towards financialization, like stock buybacks, which were re-legalized in 1982. Most people, I don't think, other than people who study this, like you and I, didn't even know stock buybacks were made illegal in the 1930s, if not even possibly before. So what happened? Instead of investing and modernizing in new steel plants, you had U.S. Steel buying out shopping malls, Marathon Oil. You might remember this too as well. That's really not jump-starting the economy. It's not helping the Rust Belt. So you have to take a look at the policies more in detail rather than, that's why I've outgrown right-wing free, so-called free market sloganeering.
Do you believe that the horse-drawn carriage industry should have been protected?
But that has nothing to do with the point.
Yes, it does. It's my counterpoint. It's my counterpoint. You don't realize that a lot of industries need to go away and new industries in their place.
Steel industries that are needed to rearm the United States. God forbid we're in a war with the Soviet Union back then, when military leaders even then were warning.
But you do realize that there are some things we need to keep our industrial economy. Obviously, that's a good point. But don't you do realize that certain industries need to be allowed to fail because they are no longer needed, right?
But this is not failing. This is misinvestment. It's not modernization. You have to, every other successful country has, even in free countries in the free world, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. I'm not saying we should go that far because they're even, frankly, much more socialistic in status that I would care to.
South Korea and Japan, you're referring to especially.
South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Germany, used to be West Germany. All these countries had massive industrial policies, and they created cutting-edge industries. We could do the same, and we did it with a more liberal, meaning laissez-faire approach compared to them, which is what I prefer.
But you see,
I would rather use government sparingly.
Right, but don't you think Reagan did a good thing by sitting down with the Japanese, who we were really concerned with? They were destroying our automobile industry, for example, and made this wonderful deal where the Japanese agreed to share in their bounty by having Japanese cars partly manufactured here with American workers, right?
Got mixed opinions. Yeah. Now, you're kind of referring, and I do, in fairness to Reagan, and in my essay, I do cite these studies. Alan Tunnelson, who used to be with the U.S. Business and Industry Council. Reagan eventually was pushed to the wall by domestic industries to put what was termed VERs, that's the acronym, the voluntary exchange agreements, and selective tariffs, which did help American industries in some cases modernize. I'm for that, and he deserves credit. But there was no real wholesale industrial policy, and there were some very bad things that his Commerce Department and his ICT voted for. I mean, communist countries in Eastern Europe were allowed, China were allowed to dump textiles. They were allowed to dump steel into the American market. Now, were they dominant market share? No. But to me, we shouldn't have, ideally, any trade with China, with any communist country, or
I agree with that. We shouldn't.
Fascist countries.
Let me ask you, since you've raised this issue of trade, let me ask you what you think of, and if it's very complicated, these current trade policies. My understanding is that Trump's tariffs that are being enforced against like just Australia. You can't get anything from Australia now. It's just shut down.
Yeah.
He has put higher tariffs on our allies, Australia, Canada, the European countries, than he's got on our enemies like China, right? What do you make of that?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I've heard your programs before. We've talked about it privately. We've talked about it on our shows. I agree with you. I think we need to build our alliances, rebuild our alliances. We have to walk a tightrope. Like we were talking about the economic issues. I think
isn't
these are nuanced issues.
Shouldn't an alliance be a sort of almost a free trade zone? Although countries, and I I definitely believe that countries need to protect industries and agriculture so they're self-sufficient in food and the basics to defend themselves, right? And of course, with some countries, like a small country like Belgium or Holland, it's not possible. Well, a small country like Sweden that has a lot of raw materials is able to do it, right? Sweden's got its own arms industry. For a country of what, 12 million, 10, 12 million people, I don't remember what their population is. For a small country, they're able to do it. And I think a country should be able to have its own industries, have its own control of food. People complain about it. You got to let American farmers into Europe. You're going to destroy European agriculture because the conditions, look at Canada and the dairy farmers. Look, it's cold in Canada. It's more expensive to produce milk in Canada. We're gonna allow American milk from the United States to come in and crush the dairy industry in Canada. Of course, Canada's going to have tariffs on them to protect their dairy farmers. Of course they are, because what happens in the future if Canada can't get American milk? They have no milk in the country then. So there are things you want your country to be able to make. You need to protect that. Like you said, steel, very important. Your industrial economy. You want to have skilled workers. You want to have welders. You want to have people who can make things. And you're going to allow that to go? We can't build ships and weapons at the rate the Russia and China can right now because we got rid of shop class. And we said, well, we're just going to outsource everything to India and China and the Philippines and Mexico. No, you're right. This is a mistake. But how do we get people to think in a common sense way about this, right? And not an ideological way.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think you're right. Look, I think the way Trump is going about the tariffs is wrong. Again, you can, number one, we have been addicted to foreign goods, and I'm not against trade with other neutral
foreign goods. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not against trade with allies and neutrals, but we also have, even with our trade agreements and tariff lowering since basically the end of World War II, we have opened our markets without any reciprocity. So we've gotten addicted to cheap, subsidized foreign goods. To reverse that, you have to do that in a way with the proper incentives to business to ultimately wean ourselves off. It's going to be gradual. You have to do a balancing act with our allies, a lot of diplomacy, selective tariffs. You're going to have to do industrial policy. You brought up education. We might have to look, and you probably won't agree with this, with tuition-free education for certain majors to incentivize people to go into trades, engineering, medicines, so we can redevelop that talent pool. One of the many positives about Americans that I find, and other foreigners have commented, we can be a very resilient and entrepreneurial and ideas laden society. Pat Choate had talked about that. That is three of our many core strengths. So we have to capitalize that. We need to do preferential credits to jumpstart these industries. Look, I come from the position, you have educated me and thousands, maybe millions of others, as well as research that I've done. Red Dawn is in store for the American public as a possibility for our country. And I like to build my policy around
if we get weaker than we are now, and the enemy gets stronger, which I think is happening, they will bomb and invade the U.S. That's their intention. Right?
Now, and there was one important point, and then I wanted to get into really your reactions to Trump's policies towards Russia, China, what's going on. Another thing, you're probably wondering, well, why am I hard on quote unquote conservatives? Let me make clear, as I made in my last essay, I like conservative values as I understand it. I like self-reliance. I like strong national defense. I like entrepreneurialism, localized communities. That's the cornerstone of my worldview. But when I look at the reality of these policies that have been enacted, plus things that you have spoken about, things I have seen personally, there's this, when they whine and cry and oppose social democrats, even ones that are anti-communist, many of these same quote unquote conservatives, I don't even like calling themselves conservatives, I usually put it in quotes for a specific reason. Many of them are all lining up. I remember I wrote a paper for Accuracy Media in 2012. They were all falling over themselves to Obama's granting of Putin's Russia PNTR, even though we knew how evil, vile, and aggressive in its intentions Putin was. It was known then. And it was the AFL-CIO that opposed giving PNTR for Putin in 2012. When you take a look at PNTR for China, I remember I wrote an article for the Sun Sentinel, the local newspaper, a letter to the editor, basically saying don't give PNTR to China back in 2000. Half the Republican Party, including some of the ones that became the Tea Party congressman types, voted to give communist China PNTR, even though their war plans, their threats, their militarism, their horrific totalitarian socialist police state hellhole was known back then. I saw the debates on C-SPAN. I would watch it, before my eyes. It was all well known. The ignorance is not really a reason necessarily. It's really they know. Just people don't care. That's the bottom line. And, that's what caused me. So I look at the history of left and right and everything, and this notion, I think one of the biggest things about anti-communists, if anything, they need to get over this left-right issue. And once upon a time, there were conservatives. Jesse Helms and Russ Feingold, for example, joined together in the Senate to try and deny communist China PNTR. And there are other examples of this. So I wanted to put that point so the listeners or you understand my intellectual journey. This is, done through a lot of personal experience as well as exposure to facts and exposure to even local politicians down here in Florida that said one thing and did another when I would ask them questions very politely, like what I'm doing now. But getting back to, I agree with everything pretty much you're saying, particularly on the trade issue. And I think with Trump, there needs to be a comprehensive policy to reindustrialize the United States. The problem is it's not a sexy issue. Congress and the Senate, they're sidetracked by a lot of other issues. Some of them, I would argue, probably don't have a bearing to the security and military preparedness of the country comparatively, but that's a different discussion for a different day. And I think trying to get the political will in all of our institutions to get behind this is going to be a very heavy lift. There are think tanks out there that are doing this, like American Compass, Foreign Cast. Julius Krein has joined in with some investors trying to work with the private sector. So these are all good steps, but they're not the mainstay of the administration. So there has to be a Manhattan-style project level commitment to reindustrialize the United States, to rebuild the social fabric of the United States. That's why I've been trying to develop my own coherent worldview called radical civic nationalism, which I would argue fulfills the goals that conservatives want but have failed to achieve, while leaving room for those portions of the left and the liberals that are opposed to Marxism, Leninism, and other forms of totalitarian socialism. So that's where I'm at. But what are your thoughts? And I titled the show Geopolitical Update, and we've been talking a lot of domestic and issues of economics. What is your thoughts on how Trump is handling Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, and now what's going on in Venezuela? You have ties with some of the people in a peripheral sense in the Trump administration. So what do you make of what's going on here?
It's hard to see behind closed doors. I have a few contacts that allow me a glimpse of what's going on. I believe that the MAGA movement has Chinese and Russian agents in it influencing it, and that they have there's a struggle within the Republican Party and the government between people who are useful idiots and or enemy agents and people who are kind of using their common sense with regard to trade policy, with regard to support for Ukraine, support for NATO, trade with China and Russia. The president came in with the idea that he was going to have, restrict Chinese trade, build up America's domestic ability to build industries. But what he's effectively done is he's basically his course is to destroy the Western alliance with his trade policy and to continue allowing China access to our capital markets and to our system and to be dumping goods on us. Maybe not at the rate before, but it's definitely happening. Of course, he's bringing in lots of revenue, but it's mainly the main balance is the Russian agents of influence, the Chinese agents of influence are prevailing. They would love to have the United States get out of NATO, allow NATO to die, side against Europe, and be on the side of Russia because Russia can help us against China. And to hell with the Europeans. Who cares about Japan or Taiwan or South Korea? We're going to have this great thing with Russia. In fact, some of them will say there's only three powers in the world, Russia, China, and America, and they need to divide the world between them. And the other countries just have to bend the knee, right? That's the extreme point of view. Extreme point of view would be, our European friends, they're not really social democrats. They're the communists. Putin's the guy, he's the Christian, he's the nationalist, he's the model that we want to follow, right? Now, you will not hear this publicly in a big way. I've heard it, behind closed doors and been shocked by it. They've kind of hidden it because it caused a reaction. There is a divide within the right, within the Republican Party, within the government, and there is a struggle going on. And I am very afraid, given the results, what we've seen, Trump will not put sanctions on Russia. He will not really control the China trade in the way it should be. And he is like this thing with Australia. It's insane. Trump's treatment of Australia and Canada caused the left to win the elections in Australia and Canada over this past year. He's caused the left to come to power. So I think that Trump has been a gift to Russia and China so far in his second term. He's been a gift to them. And I think he's going to be a gift that keeps on giving. And so I think that, Harris would have been a disaster. 100%. No way around it. Trump, I'd hoped, wouldn't be. He is turning out to be a different kind of disaster. As Mr. Magoo, which is sort of my analogy for him, a guy who's blind and doesn't know anything and is taking advice on Eastern Europe from the Hungarians, from Orban, right?
Right.
He's a Russian agent.
Yes.
This is a government that pretends to be in NATO, but it's really in the Russian bloc. Same thing with Slovakia. Maybe some of the other governments, I have problems with Tusk in Poland. But look, this is steering the ship blind. This is a captain who doesn't understand the sea, the weather, how to navigate. And of course, Mr. Magoo, he's navigating blindly. It's better to navigate blind than a person who's navigating right into a communist harbor like Harris would be. But it's still, this can be even more disastrous because you can run the ship right on the rocks at any moment. This is how erratic this man is. And you just got to hope he's going to get good advice, or he's going to wake up and go, oh, I don't want to run the ship on the rocks. Those are rocks, aren't they? This is the way I view Trump right now. Now, I think that Trump is under pressure. I think that there's probably some kind of nasty, dirty business behind the scenes that they're kind of, because I look at the first thing out of Putin's mouth, speaking to Trump in English when they shook hands on the tarmac, is, greetings, neighbor. It's good to see you're well and you are still alive, right?
Mm.
What do you mean? What is the subtext there? I think coming out of the mouth of a trained KGB operative, I think the subtext is, it's a good thing you came around, because we almost destroyed you politically. You'd be dead right now if you didn't open the door to me right now and take me out of isolation. And you've got to give me what I want, or you're going down the chutes. You will be dead. That is how I sort of interpreted, and I think that was when then by the time the meeting is over and Trump realizes it was it was just a what was it 3-4 hour meeting, and they didn't stay for dinner. They went back after coming all that way to Alaska. Trump realized that, oh my gosh, these people, they just want me to do what they want, and they don't want to talk about anything else. That is, the Russians, it's our way or the highway. And you better get with the program, or we're going to hurt you, either with nuclear war or the blackmail we're going to pour out on you, or whatever. And of course, you've got all these Republicans, including Ted Cruz, saying, I'm never going to vote for supporting Ukraine anymore. We are going to stop supporting Ukraine, which probably means, and our support, it's not financial, it's the intelligence support we give them that's allowed them to survive. We take that away, and we start giving it to the Russians, Ukraine will fall within a year. And if Ukraine falls, Europe will be in a position to be invaded by the Russians, because the Russians will then have the Ukrainian army as an indentured servant. The Russians have already said, all you Ukrainians have fought against you, you're under a death sentence. You can work that sentence off by turning your guns on your European friends and fighting for us. So that would mean that a victory of Russia and Ukraine would mean 750,000 Ukrainians would then be added to the Russian army, to a new Soviet army, and they would march on Europe, because they've said, Europe from Vladivostok to Lisbon, Europe is ours.
That's right.
We have the right to it. We're going to liberate Eastern Europe at the very least, and Europe is not ready for war. And without America, they can't stop the Russians. Well, I take it back. I think maybe they could, but at a cost of tens of millions of lives, cities bombed, Europe will look like Ukraine looks now, the whole of Europe, because the Russians will use nuclear weapons on it if it resists. And I believe that would mean the Chinese unleashed on the Pacific, he would be bombed as well. And this is where Trump is taking us, yeah.
And it's not only that, but also the Russians have been engaged in political warfare all over Europe, funding extremist parties of the left, as well as the populist right. Excuse me. So they've been engaged in softening up operation, which is look, they've wanted to do this since Cold War days, basically break up NATO, neutralize Europe, get as much technology as they can from the more advanced countries in Europe, like France and Germany, for example, and basically isolate the US. And what does the loss of Ukraine mean? Ukraine also has, as you know, large amounts of raw materials, resources, including valuable minerals. That's gone. That goes into Russian hands. That's a huge problem, not to mention the agricultural production and potential that Ukraine has despite the war. So it would be a humanitarian disaster. I mean, when you talk about, of course, what Russia's own government and semi-government publications and public figures have stated what they've done to Ukrainian kids that have been kidnapped and put in these filtration camps, as they're called. This is a horror show. This is why that crypto Bolshevism, as represented by Russia and China, needs to be stopped in its tracks. And I'm not talking about triggering a war, but supporting our allies, but also getting our population ready. One of the key things, and Reagan and FDR were very good about this in varying degrees. They understood, yes, in an imperfect way with Reagan, but they still understood there were measures that were taken of public diplomacy, including to the American public. That needs to be put on steroids, where if I were advising the president what to do, I would say get onto television and have press conferences once a week. Instead of doing these vacations like what the vice president is doing, for example, in Scotland, I would be basically having them say, you guys got to work your ass off and you got to get on TV once a week and discuss, why am I doing these policies, how it's going to benefit the people, why is Russia and China a threat? No, we don't want war with them, preemptive attack. However, we have to engage in measures to protect and rebuild our country, as well as help our allies to the best of our abilities, fend off these aggressive and subversive actions of Russia, China, as well as their other allies. So you're absolutely right, and you've documented this in your essays where you've talked about the internal splits within the Trump administration as revealed by lewd media. And there are different factions in the administration. There are people that should have no business being in government. Darren Beatty, you could look at his Twitter, and the amount of pro-CCP and pro-Russia positions that he's taken is disgusting. You look at Tulsi Gabbard. While I respect all of our military veterans and their service to their country, her positions are also deeply troubling, to the point where our Five Eyes intelligence partners apparently are refusing to share intelligence with her. What do they know? They know something. My question is also how much Curtis Yarvin still has influence with the administration. I mean, he is one of the worst people in America. I mean, he just posted 6 hours ago on Twitter, and I reposted it on my page with a rather nasty comment, I will admit. Curtis Yarvin said, and my blood boiled, Jeff, when I read this. I got pissed. He said, this Constitution, in quote unquote, and Republic, quote unquote, yapping isn't just dry as your grandma's pussy. It is, but it's also the only thing keeping you from going truly medieval on your enemies who don't believe one tiny bit in having laws and rules and stuff, and haven't since the 1930s at least. And this was a response to a national conservative, Christopher Rufo, who I'm sure you're familiar with who he is. So I saw that and I'm like, oh my God. And this is somebody who was allowed to one of the inaugural balls, who J.D. Vance quotes admiring. And this is a gentleman, Curtis Yarvin, who in his Substack explicitly called for essentially abandoning Europe to Russian influence. So yeah. Is Yarvin still relevant in the administration, or is he a has-been?
No, I think that there's a group of these people, these dark enlightenment thinking, that is sort of crept in to replace conservatism as a kind of monarchical, libertarian pseudo-Catholicism, because Yarvin attacks Protestantism. Yarvin's Jewish. He's really, I think he's a Duginist, I think is what he is, because everything he says is kind of consistent. It's a kind of a variation on Dugin's themes in other countries. Dugin has these different versions of Eurasianism for different groups. And it's almost like Yarvin is a kind of hybrid Eurasianist in the ideology that he's putting forward. It's very clever, it's very sleek, but it's extremely damaging. He's got the idea that you've got these three powers, Russia, China and the United States, and nobody else matters. And it's what they agree to divide the world between them kind of thing. And, like America should have the Western Hemisphere, and China should get, the Western Pacific and Asia, Southeast Asia and Australia and whatnot. And Russia should get Europe, and, this kind of thing. It's insane. Well, it's subversive, it's destructive, it's toxic. And there's people like, Michael Anthony, after those inauguration balls, the head of policy planning at the State Department, he would have lunch with Yarvin. Yarvin should be radioactive. This is not just wrong-headed. Like I said, it's toxic. So, but yet this administration, the vice president in particular, has an ear for this. Peter Thiel and Palantir. There's some powerful groups here on the MAGA right, and the MAGA Vatniks, the more knuckle-dragging Vatniks, of course, are like singing in harmony on another part of the stage, and it's very bad. The Trump administration could end up being convicted of being agents of our enemies, and the left could come to power, meaning real communism, and put these people in jail, and just the right could end up failing in this country, and you'd lose the two-party system, and you'd end up in a socialist dictatorship here. Because I don't believe the Democratic Party is really ruled by social democrats. I agree with you about AOC, about people like that, by Bernie, and all of these people. They're not really social democrats. Their system would be totalitarian when implemented. They're dragging us inch by inch into that kind of system. And all they have to do is have something that's ultimately discrediting to the right, and they will be able to do it. And here the right is obliging them, in my view, making horrific mistakes. And Yarvin is integral to that mistake. He's got the toxic formula.
Yeah. So clearly, yes. Yeah. It's a very sticky situation. I would, based on what I'm seeing on the outside, there definitely, as we talked about before, a fight. If I had to predict, I think there's one faction is led, or at least includes, Peter Navarro, Marco Rubio, perhaps a few others, versus others who are on the other end of the equation, who I would include J.D. Vance, probably some of the other billionaire elements within the administration. I suspect the Yarvinites, Russell Vogt, of Project 2025 people. We don't know the specifics of such divisions, so this is my hypothesis, because you have different people in the administration saying different things. Peter Navarro is quite legitimately talking publicly about the sanctions busting of India. And India, along with a number of other countries in Asia, the Middle East, and Central Asia, have been busting the sanctions on Putin's Russia. Robin Brooks, who's an investment banker, you should follow him on Twitter, for Goldman Sachs. And on X, he talks about how the former Central Asian republics are basically fronts for European trade with the Russians. And he has given tremendous detail on that. And he has a lot of experience. He's one of the good guys, many good guys in the investment and banking communities on these issues. So you have
So that's why the ruble is stabilized.
Exactly. So you have Navarro talking about this. Rubio has really made, before he entered the Trump administration, Rubio was also, at least on public statement wise, he has also mirrored a lot of my views, not only our views on Russia and China, but also on what he has termed common good capitalism and whatnot. So I would think if these folks truly believe in their positions that they're uttering, either when they were in the Senate or the Trump administration, in the case of Navarro, I sense a lot of factionalism, and this is no disrespect to Secretary Rubio. I say this as a friendly force to him. It looks like he's aged by 10 years. If you look at videos and pictures, he really doesn't look good. And that's very saddening. I think there are people in the Trump administration as we speak that are fighting the good fight, I suspect.
Well, Rubio is Secretary of State, and we're on the verge of World War III. So how would he look?
Exactly. And I think he's probably having, I suspect he might be behind closed door fending off the Yarvinites and the China and Russia appeasers, if you want to use the terms loosely. Look at Peter Navarro's last one of his books after he left the first Trump administration on it's a great book. I think it's called In Trump Time. I can run to the shelf and get it and show it to you in the audience. He talks about the inside baseball that went on in the Trump administration on decoupling with China. It was a horrible, horrible, horrible fight. It was almost as bad as what Reagan, or rather Lawrence Brady, who was an assistant secretary of commerce in the first term of the Reagan administration. And he was, after KAL 007 was destroyed by the Soviets in 1983, Brady was one of the few people that called for a complete cutoff of trade with the Soviet Union. And he had, I think, one powerful patron in the administration. You remember that, I'm sure, Judge William Clark, who I believe was the national security advisor. And I think when Clark had died, he lost that patronage. And he sent memorandums. Brady sent memorandums saying, we got to cut off trade with the Soviet Union.
There was a problem in the State Department and other departments of the government that didn't want that to happen.
Right.
How many Russian agents of influence had infiltrated those departments and were fighting for Moscow?
I think there's treason. I think that kind of treason and careerism, I think, is more widespread than I think people think. I mean, America is a very strong country in many ways, but we have a number of very, very, very glaring weaknesses that, the audience, and many of you understand this, the Russians, the Chinese, the German Nazis, the Islamic governments, they have whole institutes studying our weaknesses. They have individuals that have graduated from American universities. You look in the case of Iran, Bazad Nabavi, who was a minister of industries in the 1980s. He studied in the United States. Some of the Cuban leadership in the early Castro regime, they traveled or studied in the United States. They're stationed in the United States. They can talk like us and speak like us and eat hot dogs and hamburgers like us and enjoy Western luxury goods like any of us. But in reality, their job is to basically gather intelligence, to gather information about our weaknesses. They had a whole Institute USA in Canada that the Soviets developed under the 1970s era of détente. And that institute still exists today, as you know, Jeff. There are pictures of it with big iron gates and everything else.
Yeah, Georgy Arbatov was the head of it at the time of the end of the Cold War. And he said, we're taking away the image of your enemy. You're not going to be able to, we've got a weapon. We've got a weapon now. We're going to be the good guys. The evil empire is going away.
And that was the greatest victory.
Empire. Yeah.
That was the greatest victory. And there are secret speeches by Gorbachev, which have been declassified, which you and I have talked about many times, that talk all about it. And this is, if you want to know the root of the problem with our Russia policy, it started with the Gorbachev deception. They saw that Reagan, however imperfect, still had a lot of victories on the foreign policy front on the issue of communism. And they saw that the way to destroy Western anti-communism is to show a friendly face to convince that we're reforming and we're no longer communist. I mean, it's the oldest trick in the book. The Nazis convinced the West that they were capitalists. I kid you not. Books from the 1930s warning the British and the American public publicized that even though their economy and their government was anything but capitalist or dominated by the wealthy. You take a look at Lenin's NEP, the same thing. Mohammad Khatami during the 1990s and early 2000s in Iran, claiming he was a Islamic reformist. But when you look at actually his speeches and interviews in detail, he actually says, yeah, I'm for democracy, but I'm for Islamic democracy and law and order enforced by the Basij militia. So when you read between the lines and you read what they say in informal conversations,
it's a brutal dictatorship. It's not a free system.
Exactly.
There's no real economic freedom. There's no real freedom. There's no freedom of speech. Yeah.
And that's why you hit upon a very important point. I mean, why communism or fascism or any kind of authoritarian or even totalitarian forms of governments are just deeply problematic or horrific. It's because there's no checks and balances. The only checks and balances are their survival. They're going to be like, okay, should we do a little cosmetic reforms to survive? Or should we take a hard line in 5 years later? That's the extent of their, quote, checks and balances. There's no checks and balances, no accountability really to the people. There's no accountability to international law or our concepts of right and wrong or respect for property or respect for human life. None of that. All that comes out the window unless it serves their goals. Then they'll say, oh, okay, we'll maybe give a little property or we'll pay lip service to human rights. We'll have some token opposition newspapers and we'll have shiny buildings and everything else. But, where I come from, and I think you and I would agree on this as well, you can have nice things without bullets and bombs and totalitarianism and mass.
Well, you can't have nice things without bullets and bombs, Nevin, because you have to defend your nice things.
Well, yeah, you know what I meant, though, of course, when I say that, without the militarism and everything. They want to use bullets and bombs when they see fit.
Just a little bit of militarism. I saw that parade that Trump had, and as a person who has been in a military parade as a person, I can't believe that they couldn't march.
I know.
It's disgraceful. Look, when I was in the military, we drilled and we marched. I don't understand that the military can't do a parade and it can't march properly. This is the problem that we have. Look, there is a decline. Everything is complicated, of course, and we've got all these, there's culture and there's the military and there's politics, and it's all very complicated how to put it together. I think there's a deficit. People don't know as much as they used to, including the industrial arts. They don't cultivate understandings. They don't have debates or discussions like you and I are having. They're not informed enough to be able to even discuss these things. So we have to get back to, to everybody watching this, read books. Think, have discussions, get something in your head. Don't entertain yourself all the time. Just don't do work and entertainment. Have serious time. Spend 2 hours, spend 10 hours a week reading serious books, not comic books. I read comic books. No, serious books. Please cultivate your mind. And this isn't, it is, well, I'm out of college. I already know what I need to know. No, you don't. Because they're lying to you on social media. They're lying to you on television. They're lying to themselves. They don't know what the truth is. You have to figure that out. You're an adult. You're a citizen. You need to know things in order to function as a citizen of a free country and to keep your freedom. To know, wait a minute, I got to stand up for this. I gotta go against that. I've got to tell my friends, you have to have this, or we're not going to be free much longer. And we are headed for a war. It looks like it. Maybe we'll swerve at the last minute, but it looks like we're headed for a war. And if Trump had put sanctions on Russia at the beginning of his administration, there might not be a war because Russia and China would be beating a path of retreat, serious sanctions. But no, he puts the sanctions basically on our allies and nothing on Russia, really. He's letting Russia through the loopholes to get out, and China lighter trade tariffs, right, than our neighbors and allies. So we're in trouble.
Yeah. And look, there are some noises made in the right direction on certain things on the surface. Yes, I would agree with that.
Lip service.
But it's lip service, generally speaking. I mean, you look at Venezuela. I mean, look, they are involved with the drug cartels.
And they just mobilized 4.5 million men because the U.S. is going after the drug cartels, their buddies, their lifeline, right?
Exactly. And I'm not just saying that's a bad thing necessarily, but then, what was it, scarcely a month or two ago, we've been providing Chevron with sanction waivers to allow Venezuelan oil to be imported into the American market, which is something that Laura Loomer, who's a prominent pro-Trump influencer, supports. And, look,
would you support the U.S. military going into Venezuela?
That's an interesting question. I don't want to cop out and say I don't know, because I'm trying to weigh the positives and negatives. On the one hand, Venezuela is part of the Sino-Russian axis, and they're a threat, even though they're very unstable. The communist dictatorship is deeply unpopular with its people. On the other, and that I know, I used to date a Venezuelan woman, so I know, and she would show me pictures of.
I think the same is true in Cuba.
Yeah. Oh, it's horrible.
People are exasperated in Cuba. Look, if we did the policy towards Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua correctly, I don't think those regimes would have an easy time holding on in the long run. I think that they would be reversed at some point. But of course, they would try this fake perestroika where we're going to allow democracy, like the Sandinistas did at the end of the Contra war. Oh yeah, we're going to have a democracy. And they just sort of hibernated. And as soon as nobody was looking, they went and seized power again. Daniel Ortega is now a dictator again. So, so the thing is we have to not be stupid and allow ourselves to be constantly fooled and manipulated by the communists, which we are. I don't know how we get around this problem, but we have to grow up and become serious and get over this problem and actually say, this is an enemy, this is a friend, this has got to be defeated. This line we have to hold. But we seem incapable of doing it since World War II. We're not really able to do it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes through education. I think a lot of it has to be done by
communists have taken over education.
What I mean is education. Get around the universities, the colleges, the mainstream media,
fund them.
And literally a president and members of the administration get on press conferences, fireside chats, say this is what's going on without burning intelligence sources, obviously, and just do a constant bombardment of facts and information that's simplified by an effective communicator so he can get his or her point across to the American people. That's part of the mobilization that is necessary, as an intellectual mobilization. Now, how do you convince a public that, well, the Cold War really ended in the late 1980s, early 1990s? That's going to be a tall order. Look, you and I do our parts. You write your very scholarly, well-written articles. You have your podcasts. You've done tremendous, tremendous work, longer than I've been at it, in sounding the alarm and educated people, and you deserve a lot of kudos and credit for that, a tremendous amount. I write all these highly detailed, dense papers, which the purpose of the dense facts is maybe it's not crazy. Maybe people like Nyquist and Loudon and Nevin and Jimmy from Brooklyn and Johnny Anderson and Cliff Kincaid and a handful of other people are not crazy, raging lunatics. These are real facts from primary sources, secondary sources, mainstream media, defector information. Maybe these guys have a point, and maybe we need to handle this a little differently. To your question about invading Venezuela, I mean, I listed my litany of concerns with Venezuela. The other hand, as I saw, our interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they turned out to be very bungled and mishandled, and we really didn't adequately defend why we were there. And my concern is that you could have the potential for explosive Latin American anti-Yankee nationalism that they could play upon. They could really give our troops a run for the money, and we're not going to adequately defend why we're supposedly there, because we didn't do a good job in Vietnam, and we allowed the so-called anti-war movement to steal the narrative because we didn't have an effective counter-propaganda strategy. And the same thing with the Iraq and Afghanistan war for most of the 2000s. So, it just requires, and you've talked about this before, Jeff, and I think you're correct, it requires a new paradigm of leadership entirely, with a different set of ethics and values and priorities. It requires a quasi-warrior aristocracy almost, not belligerent, but a group of people that are intellectually disciplined, that are rooted in the interests of the country, that are wedded with a sense of empathy balanced by strength, so they're not pushed around either. And where we get those people, that's anyone's guess. But I know people are out there. I've spoken with them, and many of them tend to be average people that are not in the public eye, but are politically engaged and very well thought out. I mean, I'll give an example right now. If I were President of the United States and choosing an administration, I would make you National Security Advisor, Jeff. And I know I'm not trying to butter you up. I'm serious. Why? Because you are grounded in facts. You're very passionate about the survival of the country. And you're also not a reckless interventionist either. You're very careful in your thought process. So a guy like me who's very sort of practical, has principles, but is very careful, that attracts me to you in that way. That, forget I know you and we're friendly and everything. Those are the types of people I would want in administration. I don't like extremes. I get very weary of, a lot of different people,
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be a Nevin Gusick administration. So I don't think I'm ever going to be a national security advisor. But yeah, no, I would want somebody who understands these things to be national security advisor, to be Secretary of State, to be Secretary of Defense, because I think now whatever mistakes I've made, whatever things I don't understand, I think that the truth, the strategic truth about Russia and China and our position is clear, whatever other things are out there. And that if we don't get that right, we could end up being destroyed in a war. And or destroyed through our own foreign policy mistakes. I end up isolated, and so it's yeah. I don't understand why there's this tremendous deficit of understanding and knowledge, but there is, and this is what we have to cope with.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think we should do in Venezuela? What would you recommend at this point?
Well, you see how they used any movement of ships or military towards Venezuela as an excuse to mobilize 4.5 million men. This is either a confession of the regime's fragility, or they're mobilizing because Russia's about to do something in Eastern Europe and they want to be ready. The second one is kind of scary, the second possibility. I don't think you can, strategy of a direct assault on these countries might play into the hands of the dictator. But I think that isolating them as we've isolated Cuba and showing every bit of support, if there's an uprising in Cuba, in Venezuela, we should support it. And military intervention should occur if there's a mass uprising. And we should make it clear that if the people of those countries go into the streets and they start gunning them down, we're going to intervene. And I don't know, in the case of Cuba, I think if it's true, I mean, Johnny Anderson and I, we were looking at these missiles in Cuba that were there. They were about the size of, a little bit smaller than intermediate range ballistic missiles. We couldn't figure out. They didn't have a truck platform. We were looking at what they are. They were they were kitchen missiles, KH-22s. That is anti-ship cruise missiles. And they were stacked up near a very significant strategic air base in Cuba, and exactly the place you needed to control the Caribbean Sea, being able to attack American ships. We need to bomb those places. We need to take out Cuba's air defenses the same way Israel has taken out Iran's air defenses. And we have to tell the Cuban people, hey, if you want to change a government, we will support you with airstrikes. And we have to, I think we have to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, because Cuba is a Russian-Chinese base in the Western Hemisphere. Nicaragua is the same thing. Venezuela is the same thing. I think that Secretary of State John Quincy Adams was a genius. He was our best Secretary of State in American history. And I think the Monroe Doctrine is something, since we have the biggest Navy, not the biggest Navy anymore, I think we have the best Navy in the world right now. We're outnumbered, of course, by Russia, China, and North Korea put together, but the Caribbean should be our sea. And there shouldn't be enemy anti-ship missiles able to operate in the Caribbean. That's my opinion. And I don't think we need to use land troops, except maybe very selectively, and not to occupy anybody. You know, Venezuela for the Venezuelans, Cuba for the Cubans, but no Russians, no Chinese, no foreign enemies in there. You have your freedom, not troops from other continents, because there are Russian and Chinese troops in Venezuela, and I believe there are Russian and Chinese military personnel, intelligence personnel in Cuba and Nicaragua.
Oh, that's openly known.
So we need to wave goodbye at them. You Chinese and Russians, and the Chinese should not be welcomed in our hemisphere. They shouldn't be building ports. They shouldn't be, manipulating governments like the Brazilian government. We should be for saying, look, we know the Latin American people all want to be free. We're for their freedom, and we will protect it with the Monroe Doctrine. Thank you, John Quincy Adams.
Yeah, thank you. But unfortunately, that's been swept under the rug to a degree. You're right. There are Chinese. Since 2008, you have Chinese military personnel. The PLA special forces are advising and training the Cuban special forces, the so-called Avispas Negros, I believe they're called.
We can't have 4.5 million troops in a Latin American country basically under control of the communist bloc. We can't have that on our hemisphere. Those 4.5 million troops should be defending the hemisphere against China and Russia. And, it was commander of Southern Command, General Laura Richardson, who said a few years ago, China and Russia are moving in and taking over the Western Hemisphere south of the Rio Grande. And we're not doing anything about it. We didn't. The Biden administration wasn't going to do anything. The Trump administration gave lip service. You know, we're going to control the canal. We're going to do this. That I think the Chinese company that controls, Whampoa Hutchinson controls both ends of the canal, I think has been kicked out, but I'm not sure that really happened. But we need to be in control of this hemisphere, because all these MAGA-vatniks say, oh, we're surrounding Russia. Russia's the biggest country in the world. It's very hard for it not to be, in some sense, have other countries around it. Russia's not surrounded. You know, China and Mongolia are pro-Russian. Central Asia is pro-Russia's not surrounded. We're surrounded. They're in Mexico, even, the communists. They're all over Latin America. They're in Canada. When I was in Canada, I was told by conservative, one of the leading conservative politicians in Canada said, you got to tell your friends China has taken over Canada. So look, we're being surrounded in our own hemisphere. It has to end. If the one thing we do is right, is we make sure that they don't control in our hemisphere. And I think we'll have a much easier time defending Europe and the Pacific if we do that.
Yeah, and there's another side to this. Let's take a look at how let's take Venezuela and Cuba.
Doctrine 2.0.
Venezuela, when they had an embassy in Washington, D.C., their ambassador, Bernardo Alvarez, other diplomats, they've had ties with Code Pink, prominent elements of the left wing of the Democratic Party, Workers' World Party. When you take a look at Cuba, Cuba continues to have ties with American communist groups.
Vile regime in Cuba.
Oh, of course it's vile. It's horrendous. It's at a point where, I don't even want to go into it, but you look at CBIN. CBIN is the Venezuelan intelligence service. It stands for Bolivarian Intelligence Service. They been implicated in cyber attacks against American infrastructure.
These are acts of war, by the way. Acts of war.
So this is the way to make it relevant, I think, is not only how how they have the troops and the advisors. You're referring to the Wagner group in Venezuela, and what I mentioned in Cuba, but they're also here too as well, intervening in our affairs. It's not, and the problem is with
I would like to see a U.S. president who comes before Congress and lays out the acts of war that Russia, China, Cuba, Venezuela have committed against this country, and ask for declarations of war on these countries. Not that we would exchange nukes, but if there is an understanding that we're at war with Russia, however that war is fought, we wouldn't be able to trade with them. We wouldn't be able to, any act supporting them would be treason, and we could arrest the people. But a declaration of war, not meaning we have to exchange nukes or actually fight with armies, but an understanding that we're at war with these countries would put into U.S. law the fear of God on the part of all the collaborators and agents of influence, because then you could arrest them, put them on trial, put them in jail, hang them, because treason is a capital offense. But right now, we won't say we're at war when we really are at war. And I'm glad you made that point. Poland is secretly, I've seen the mobilization orders. Poland is mobilizing soldiers now. The mobilization, the call-ups have begun in Poland. Why did they just begin? There was a cruise missile in Poland, a Russian cruise missile deep into Poland with an armed warhead headed for Poland's biggest ammunition depot to blow it up. And luckily that cruise missile hit a power line and crashed and blew up. But that's an act of war by Russia against Poland, against a NATO country. So it isn't just acts of war. Cyber attack is an act of war on the United States. It's not just an act of war against us and our allies across the board. And this is what we need. We need a bipartisan consensus so that we can go, all right, we're in a state of war with these people. We can't trade with the Chinese or the Russians. We have to treat them all like we treat Cuba. And if any country doesn't, if these countries in NATO, an attack on one is an attack on all, we have to understand, we have to get ready, because they consider themselves at war with us and they're coming for us. But these stupid Americans and Europeans, they're sitting down and talking to us and trading and still giving us technology and still giving us access to their capital markets. What are we, idiots? Don't answer that question. We are. And it's got to end, or were there going to be tens of millions of people or hundreds of millions of people in the Western world dead, and cities in rubble, and people starving. It's going to happen if we don't smarten up.
Well, what is Colonel Lunev, who you knew personally, who was a Yeltsin-era defector? Let's outline the Red Dawn plans for those of you who are new to the show. What did Colonel Lunev describe a little bit about his background and what he told you personally?
Well, the Russians and Chinese, when Boris Yeltsin came into power, shortly before Lunev defected, Lunev knew operational plans. He was the deputy head of the GRU in the U.S. And Lunev he was kept informed of this, and Russia and China had made agreements on massive intelligence sharing on America, where they would coordinate their operations here in the U.S. against the U.S. for ultimately to destroy the U.S., invade North America, divide the continent between Russia and China, with other countries invited in for looting rights. And, Russia would get Alaska and parts of Canada. China would get the lower 48 states and I guess parts of Canada. Maybe Quebec would be an independent communist country. I don't know. He didn't give me that detail, but and this, by the way, completely dovetails with Chinese Defense Minister Chiao Chen's secret speech saying we have been given the lower 48 states to occupy and to create a second China there. We're going to exterminate the Americans there. And it's, according to Lunev, it's an infiltration invasion. So they infiltrate the U.S. through our economic trade with China. That infiltration then, it's based on the German Operation Weserübung, the German invasion of Norway in 1940, where they infiltrated troops as tourists, and they had stockpiled weapons in the country in advance, and they just came into the country through trade ships, and just German troops just appeared in the Norwegian ports and airfields, and the British Navy was sitting off those ports and airfields, was sitting off the coast. And the German Navy made considerable sacrifices in ships and men to get through, but they were able to do it. Now, the British Navy was the most powerful Navy in the world at the time. And they were, and here you had an invasion of a country over water by land-powered Germany through infiltration. It was an amazing feat. But they realized, that this is how they would have to do in North America. And you see the Chinese billionaire, in Texas with the 10,000-foot runway at the wind farm. You see these Chinese businesses with little airstrips and also drone airstrips, and they're smuggling drones and people. We've got Chinese defectors saying, like Mr. Wang of Luda Media saying, look, they've got a program to infiltrate 250,000 People's Liberation Army soldiers as illegal aliens into the United States, to get the foothold in here, to suddenly appear at the ports and airports, and will have selective nuclear strikes against our deterrent and against our military bases so that they could take over the U.S. This isn't a fantasy. You've got people like Scott Gulbranson in The Silent Invasion writing about it, back in, 20 plus years ago, going down into Mexico, finding out about Chinese weapons smuggling into Mexico more than 20 years ago, then smuggling some of those weapons across the U.S. border through U.S. customs. This is an old problem. You've got the Sidewinder report in Canada. They're doing the same thing through Canada, using the Chinese triads. The Chinese organized crime is aligned with the PLA and the Chinese intelligence services. Sidewinder report came out in 1997. They're going to use Canada as a highway for invading the U.S. in the flank. All the evidence for a infiltration invasion is there in the work of journalists who've been ignored, in the work of, the Sidewinder report was a report by the Canadian Mounted Police and the CSIS, the Canadian CIA. Ignored, right? We have allowed this in broad daylight. The evidence is right there in front of everybody's face. Nobody cares. We're making money. Let's stay with China. They're not really bad. They're not really communist. They're capitalists, the Chinese. This is what I get. It's like, I want to beat them over the head and say, wake up, idiot.
Well, the same individuals said the same thing about Nazi Germany, and there were those authors like Günter Riemann in the 1930s and early 1940s who warned us that was complete nonsense. You had the book by Carl Roberts, a pseudonym. Who knows who the author was? There were some suspicions. It might have been several people. Carl Roberts, Hitler's Counterfeit Reich, I believe it was called. You had Nazi defectors like Hermann Rauschnick, Kurt Ludeck, as well as also a Nazi consular officer who defected.
What was Rauschnick's book? Was The Voice of Destruction, was it?
Yeah, he had several books, Revolution and Nihilism, Voice of Destruction. This is a really good book. It's very...
But these are the defectors from National Socialism giving the same kind of warnings
Exactly.
that the defectors from International Socialism, Russia and China, are trying to tell us. People like Li Mengyan, for example, who warned us about this virus was intentionally released, this COVID-19. It was a weapon released by the Chinese on purpose. Look, you have to listen to these people, because the only real information we're going to get from these regimes that lie and hide the truth is from people who have gotten out from the inside of these regimes with the truth. And the defector literature is just ignored by the scholars, by the experts, by the politicians. And
sometimes they also say it out loud. I want to get back to this DSA thing. I sent it to you in private chat. And this is on the World Socialist website. And we know that socialist communist groups, they have their rivalries and whatnot, but they're united on, I must add, common core principles. Nikin Fayazi, a member of the National Coordinating Committee of the Young Democratic Socialists of America, presents one such photo with the ice pick in Trotsky's head with the caption, quote, "This might come in handy today." Asheville, North Carolina DSA member Dan Posey proposes erecting a memorial to Trotsky's assassin, reading in memory of Ramon Mercader.
Yeah, the assassin who, when he got out, he was given the Order of Lenin by Khrushchev.
Yes.
Yeah.
He, in memorial of
got out of jail. The murderer
Mercader,
of Trotsky was released ultimately from the Mexican prison. Ultimately,
he showed us the way. And a tweet by a recent DSA East Bay, California steering committee member reads, quote, "Ice pick jokes will never not be funny," and quote, "We will all continue making ice pick jokes publicly plus unapologetically." This is a very long article. Encouraged, I shared it with our friend Trevor Loudon. I put it on my Substack paper, Why I Oppose Communism. That's the title. So on many occasions, these individuals of the totalitarian elements of the left, and I consider quite a few DSA people totalitarians. And it did have moderates and whatnot, and they generally have kind of pushed out, resigned, and everything else. But this is really, when you look at the tone of these phrases, these are evil, vile, awful, unimaginably, I think ugly is too kind of a word. This is where it's at. These groups are growing. And this is why I, adjusted my politics in some ways without really never losing sight of our common goals that we have, Jeff. But I'm definitely afraid of these people. I mean, they're supporting the murder of a Trotsky who is a fellow totalitarian, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn reminded us in his speech and book, Warning to the West. Trotsky was just as totalitarian as the DSA.
Well, they kill their own. Yeah, of course they do. Yeah. They kill everybody.
I mean, these are, as you said, look, we can talk about, I like to get to the root causes of radicalization. But with that stated, can't lose the fact that these are still criminally minded elements.
These are psychologically damaged, psychotic people. As Luna pointed out, these are not normal people. They're not psychologically normal. And it was Eric Voegelin who really diagnosed the sources of totalitarianism in his books, and he said these are people who get their self-affirmation, their sense of self, from murdering other people, and it is about murder for the sake of murder, and it is the same thing. A criminal gets a kind of self-affirmation from stealing and cheating and fooling other people, and also you can get it from murdering people. This is what the appeal is. It's rather satanic in its soul. So these are people who are evil. You go to someone like even Sam Vaknin said, well, malignant narcissisms, psychopaths, maybe they're right and it's just evil. It's just a way of another way of describing something that's demonic, right? I think we have to come down to that. And what the psychology is it's taking pleasure in destruction, taking pleasure in murder, taking pleasure in, and really you can take pleasure in anything, as perverted as it is. And this is what's at the root of it. And I'm sorry, it's not, a lot of sweet people think, oh, the beautiful socialist world. It's like Mao, Stalin, when you try it, Castro, Hitler, any kind of 1,000-year beautiful millennial Reich or lion lying down with the lamb, Karl Marx's beautiful future, anything like that, run, psycho killer, run away, because these people aren't psychologically normal. Human life can't be this, and politics isn't about this. It's not about utopia. Human politics is about, we're all kind of pretty broken and bad, and we have to keep the bad people from getting power. So we got to have checks and balances here. That's what it's really about.
Yeah, no, I agree
with that. Yeah, so that in a nutshell, if you want to understand totalitarianism and power and politics, and I'm not proposing an ideology, I'm just proposing common sense measures to stay alive and keep your freedom. because it's what is it that we all want? And of course, at the bottom, it's a spiritual problem of containing evil.
There's that, and Arthur Schlesinger also had good insights. I think Verglen and Schlesinger, combine them together, make the most sense to me. And he wrote The Appeal of Totalitarianism. I see this in the testimonies and the interviews of the people who join these organizations, whether fascism or communism or other totalitarian forms of socialism, because all forms of totalitarianism is some perverted, warped version of socialism, which really is just another form of oligarchy, as the so-called democratic socialist George Orwell had talked about, particularly in the last 10 years of his life. And Schlesinger said also, is very interesting, against the loneliness and rootlessness of man in free society, the totalitarian state promises the security and comradeships of a crusading unity propelled by a deep and driving faith. The fear of isolation, the flight from anxiety lie at the bottom of the totalitarian appeal. He says man longs to escape the pressures beating down on his frail individuality, and more, the surest means of escape seems to be to surrender that individuality to some massive external authority. Free society alienates the lonely and uprooted masses, while totalitarianism, building on their frustrations and cravings, provides a structure of belief, men to worship and men to hate, and rights which guarantee salvation. So that environment causes people to hate. When there's something wrong with you, or you're a broken individual for whatever reason, and you combine those factors, as Verglen and Schlesinger points out, it's a recipe for a disaster if these people come to power and rule over an entire country. And this is why you and I have our joint as well as different projects. At the end of the day, we're trying to contain this possible future that the world may have. And that's terrifying, and in many occasions, they make no secret of the ruthlessness. And this is why I developed my project, my writing, and my podcast to try and create a viable alternative. And rather than me just sitting here complaining privately to people, I need to put it out in the arena and share these thoughts and debate these thoughts. And before we go, there are a couple of warnings. There's also such a thing as a fake social democrat, to get to a couple of earlier points. You have individuals that claim to be Democrats, like our friend, sarcastically, Ronald Dulles, or several Democrats today, like a Judy Chu from California. These people pose as Democrats. They may pose as New Deal liberals or populists or whatever, but they have communist sympathies. In fact, I am convinced that Ronald Dulles was a secret communist. That is a fake social democrat. They are not New Deal 20th century liberals, because they were for capitalists, while Ronald Dulles was a communist who was working hand in glove with communist states and movements. When you have in Britain, James Lamond, George Galloway at one time, Stanley Newlands and others, these were members of the Labor Party. They were pro-Soviet to the extreme. Ronald Brown was another one. So you have these fake social democrats that join social democrat parties as part of Lenin's program in the early 19...
They take them over, and they're really just the Democratic Party is a front for the Communist Party USA.
And that has happened with factions of each of the parties that I have outlined.
I don't have any confidence in the Democratic Party coming up with a presidential candidate, or very many candidates that are not. They're increasingly changing over their cadre, their leadership, to people who are closet communists, I think. And of course, this isn't a surprise to me, because I heard a communist say in March of I was at a meeting in March of 1983, we're taking over the Democratic Party through its left wing. And he was a Communist Party USA speaker. And I've seen it. I think it's pretty obvious what has happened. The Democratic Party is is a party of treason and destructionism and totalitarianism. I hate to say that, but until it expels the communists, it's not going to be a party that is acceptable in this country. I don't understand why anyone would be a member of it that is not a communist, because you look at its policies, everything the Democratic Party does is part of the program of the Communist Party USA. The Road to Socialism document.
The Bill of Rights, socialism, yeah, but that's
and of course the pretense that they're against Russia, I don't believe them for a minute. They're such liars. People like Biden, people like the Obamas, people like the Clintons.
Well, Obama, I definitely don't trust. He is insincere on Russia because he put it on the reset and the détente with Putin on such steroids that was I can't think of a foreign policy achievement of Barack Obama that was good, to be honest with you.
And I will give them this credit. They wouldn't actually Bill Clinton wouldn't give Europe to Russia, to Boris Yeltsin, when he asked for it in 1999. But I think that was more of a matter of self-preservation. At least some of these guys will not commit suicide for the cause, because that's what the Russians expect from the true believers. The Russians and Chinese communists. But look, everybody needs to wake up and realize what this is, what we're up against. And I want to thank you for inviting me on here. And I think we've had a good discussion.
Yeah, I think it's been a great discussion. I did want to add one more point about, I don't mean to hijack the situation, but I also like to meet people halfway.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, I guess. All right. But about the regulation and law issue, there are issues where, for example, with reindustrialization, that do need to be addressed. And I'll make closing comments and you can discuss where people can find your works. There's the issue of permitting processes, where permitting, you need to, I don't know if you need to hire more people to expedite the permitting process, to review it, to get them through. When you look at something, I was involved with a community board project in Brooklyn to preserve industrial and maritime jobs in Brooklyn, New York, because I'm from the Long Island, New York City area. And one of the major issues with dredging waterways, because the sediment was so toxic that it was difficult to dispose of it. One of the issues with permitting new industrial facilities and dredging, you couldn't get the turnover fast enough to get it processed so that sediment or industrial facilities could be expanded, because it was just holdups, and businesses don't have time. My family is full of business people. I work for them. It's not a picnic all the time either. When you have a mom and pop or a medium or even large industrial company or stores or a restaurant, you got to get the things going. You got to constantly moving. And there needs to be, that's one granular example of where there needs to be vast improvements. The other thing is that I would recommend a good book. You probably have read it, Jeff. I'm sure you've heard of it, called The Death of Common Sense by Philip K. Howard, who talk show hosts like Chuck Harder, who was very much aligned with me on a number of views, even recommended that too. And there are a number of examples in there where there is just BS laws that really have no public interest level there. And I talk about it in my essays. I did make a brief mention, because when you look at issues of foreign policy or economics or politics, it's very complicated. You can't do the right-wing or left-wing sloganeering. When you look at the facts in a dispassionate way, and when your heart is rooted in the national and public interest, then sloganeering from either side saying more government across the board and that's it, or let's just withdraw the government totally or do blanket deregulation without looking at the real world consequences, or when it comes to let's just isolate ourselves from our allies and be a hermetically sealed country, or let's stick our heads in the sand and pretend that there's not a Cold War continuing, despite the evidence to the contrary. It's not the way to do public policy. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why we've gotten into such trouble in the US. Jeff, did you have any closing comments as well as comments on where people can find your work?
My Amazon page, there's several books people can order. I think the good one to start out with is The Fool and His Enemy. That's my favorite little one. It's a short book, quick read, 3 hours. And then my website is jrnyquist.blog, jrnyquist.blog. So I just thank you for having me on this podcast.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for always appearing. You're always so flexible and approachable. I really appreciate that. I'm glad we had this discussion. I think we've covered a lot of material, and we'll continue to have you on as developments continue to unravel.
Thank you.
All righty. Let me, hold on. Hold on.